All right, guys, welcome back to the Addiction Mindset Recovery Coaching YouTube channel. Welcome to part one of a conversation regarding tough love with regard to substance use and discussions surrounding if you have a child who's using substances or another family member who's consuming substances and you're thinking about kicking them out of the house. If you're concerned about enabling their behaviors, that's really what today's conversation is going to be focused around. I'm here today with one of my favorite individuals when it comes to topics, anything substance use, Macaulay. He can be found at Sexton Space on all social media platforms. And what he really offers is consulting in regard to harm reduction and harm reduction principles. So, Macaulay, thanks for joining me today. I'm super excited about this.
Good to see you, brother. Thanks for
Yeah,
having me.
at any time. So, Macaulay, I want to start off with just a straightforward scenario. Okay, let's say we have a 19-year-old male. He lives at home with mom and dad. There's no other siblings, and he is consuming cannabis on a regular basis. Okay, mom and dad and others are absolutely convinced that he's addicted to cannabis, and maybe they feel that they've seen his life deteriorate in negative aspects from it. They feel he's maybe less motivated, withdrawn from sports. His career has maybe suffered, and they feel that it's due to cannabis use. So they say, listen, we have a zero tolerance policy in our home. We do not allow the consumption of cannabis, alcohol, any substances. And we're thinking at this point we have to kick our son out of our house. Where would you start with this conversation and this specific circumstance?
So it starts off with open communication that's based in empathy, understanding, and a baseline level of education when it comes to substance use disorders, even if we're just talking about cannabis use disorder. So there's work to be done prior to even having a conversation that each family has the opportunity to engage in. And so what that looks like is understanding substance use disorder from a more scientific space, from a more evidence based space, because people's initial reaction is going to be from a place of stigma, generally speaking. That's the average person, their understanding of addiction is based on preconceived notions, social stigmas, and the fact that it's been like these ideas have been influenced by one space, quite frankly. So it's been influenced by 12 step. That's
Yep.
most people, that's when they hear addiction, alcoholism, any of these terms, immediately all the information they have is usually being influenced by that space, and again, social stigma. So the first thing is to educate yourself on specifically cannabis use disorder, what that is, and understand that we're dealing with someone, if they have cannabis use disorder, that very likely is in a mental health crisis. Very likely. I'm not going to project that onto everyone, but that's often the case when we're dealing with substance use disorders, because it's usually co-occurring. So again, then kind of understanding maybe just some tactics when it comes to communicating. And in all honesty, there are some scenarios to where I think there would actually have to be a moderator present with the first conversation. That's something that a lot of people maybe don't consider, and that's not always going to be the answer. Sometimes that can create other weird dynamics. If it's like, oh, now there's some like random person here that's sitting, and I'm not saying this in the terms of like an intervention. I'm saying in terms of facilitating a productive conversation. That's it. Now, in regards to like setting a boundary, and what people would feel is like setting that boundary is not enabling. That's how you don't enable. I think we need to reframe the term enabling. And I think that we need to enable people to utilize resources instead of focusing on this idea of not enabling someone to consume substances, because
So
that. Go ahead. Sorry.
I'm sorry. No. This is really good. You talk about enabling. So to start off on a basic scenario, if I'm the parents, I'm thinking, well, if I allow Johnny to consume cannabis in his bedroom, am I not enabling him to consume cannabis in my home? Is that
So,
kind of the type of enabling that we're discussing, or the thought of
well,
enabling that we think is going on with the
yeah,
family?
yeah. So the general idea of enabling is that you are like either like passively or just in somehow allowing certain behaviors or the consumption of specific things. So it ends up being like a punitive thing. It's like, okay, so we can't enable this person. So what does that mean? We need to stop them from doing this. And then what does that translate to? If they don't, then I now am kicking out my loved one.
Yes.
Now this goes to a whole other area of, again, before I go into that, enabling should be reframed. It's an overused concept. It's weaponized, and it isolates people who are often in a mental health crisis. That's something that needs to be very clear and understood. At the same time, I'm not saying people aren't allowed to set boundaries. So that, again, kind of we can kind of go into this next area, which is boundaries as it relates to the concept of enabling. And again, these, in my opinion, should not be implemented in with any sort of expectation to get a desired result from someone else. That's what people are doing when, again, they're going into this anti-enabling rhetoric, and they're going into this setting boundaries. It's a misrepresentation of what boundaries are and how they are set according to, like, if you were to talk to a clinician about it, like, they're going to tell you, like, a boundary is for you. You set a boundary for yourself. You don't set a boundary for other people. That's not how that works. Everyone has to implement their own boundaries, and it's a fruitless pursuit to try to implement a boundary in someone else's life. It just doesn't. That's not how humans work. So again, a lot of this, it turns into this punitive thing. And to kind of backtrack a little bit, or just to go back a little bit, the conversation, you know, where you're laying out like, this is not tolerable and all this other stuff,
Mm-hmm.
it again is usually from a frustrated place. So that kind of segues into like the tough love stuff that you're mentioning. And people are frustrated with their loved one. They feel like they're not maybe living up to their full potential. There may be behavioral issues and all that other stuff, and so that creates this frustration that can like pile up. I always use the analogy of like, you're just like making a pile of frustration and like less than favorable experiences with your loved one. So then when you meet them, you're kind of unloading those things, even if it's passively. So I always say that like tough love is usually like either the passive or direct expression of anger towards someone with the expectation of change. And you know, it just, yes, there are going to be people who have experienced this and somehow it played out in a way that maybe was more positive. But a lot of times what ends up happening is you end up isolating someone who's extremely vulnerable. And that's usually the scenario. And that's where you see people who are kind of introduced to a life of being unhoused and a lot of stuff like that.
And I think in many cases, what you said, the expectation that, so the person, the family member have the expectation, okay, he's 19, we'll kick him out. He doesn't have an income. He's going to have to stop, right? He's going to
Yeah.
have to stop smoking or drinking or whatever, popping
Yeah.
pills. It doesn't really matter what it is. And what I think I'm hearing you say is that expectation often doesn't play out correctly. And I think that's really important, because you're making a really good point that, and I think this goes back to your point of consulting with someone who kind of has some experience in this space, is what are proper expectations for on the parents' end? So you're going to do X, Y, and Z. What do you think is going to happen if you do X, Y, and Z? And does that line up with what often happens? Or are you going into this scenario with frustration, as you said, anger, which understandably so, but are you
Yeah.
going into this and are you going to wind up with a whole different outcome that does not align with your expectations at all? That's a really interesting point.
Yeah, I mean, it's the truth of the matter is this goes into like prohibition and all these other ideas that like restricting someone is going to like stop certain behaviors. No, it makes those behaviors more risky. That's just how, and again, that's based in evidence. I'm not just kind of making these claims. Like, that is what happens is, if that is someone's only thing that they feel works for them, and you're saying like, no, you can't do this, it doesn't mean that they're going to stop if they're unhoused. It means that they're probably going to end up doing, you know, things that are far more dangerous. Usually that's usually how that begins. And I mean, I've seen this play out. I've seen this play out repeatedly with people. And at the same time, you deserve to set your own boundaries when it comes to what is acceptable in your home. Like that, I'm not trying to downplay any of that, but there needs to be an informed decision that's being made here. And often, again, it is out of a place of fear, and it's not from an educated place. And so people need to understand that going to a person in recovery, going to a professional in the treatment industry and asking them these questions, you're often going to get the worst possible answer, like the worst possible answer, because many of these people they've faced interventions, they've been given ultimatums. I'm one of them. I was given an ultimatum of like, you go to treatment or you are unhoused on the streets. Now, this is after years of already living in motels and stuff and having periods like that. So for me, as like someone who'd experienced that, that was not, I was like, that's not tolerable for me at this point. I'm going to go to treatment because of that, you know. But I check my bias there, and I go, because when I first started talking about this stuff, I was like pro ultimatums and pro, like, you know, kicking people out if you need to. And I'm still okay with each individual engaging in their own autonomy and going about this based on their needs and their family needs as a whole. But again, people just need to be very careful in who they're talking to about this, where they're going for information, because if we're going to like certain treatment industry, quote unquote, professionals, the whole thing is going to be, let's get them to rock bottom and let's get them to that space. And that brings up a whole other topic, is that's also the desired result that people are either intentionally or unintentionally steering someone towards when you are in the, I'm not going to enable, I'm not going to, allow this in my home. It often leads to this idea, or it's being, kind of radicalized by this idea that you then will get some sort of desired result. Now, in this day and age, when we talk about rock bottom, it's really people dying. Like that's what happens. And so when you see someone who is in a mental health crisis, they have a substance use disorder, they're now unhoused, they don't have anything to lose at that point. So then it's like, is someone going to be more likely to take a powder or a pill maybe now? Yeah, they are. Yeah. Are they going to be more likely to start drinking? Maybe. Yes, they are. Like, and so again, it needs to be treated as a mental health crisis first, more than anything. And so what you do is, again, if you offer all of these different resources in a very compassionate, loving way, but also express your anger in the right setting with the right people, then you'll be able to express all your emotions. You'll be able to go about this in a way that's tactful and that's based on like evidence. And you can say, hey, my hands are clean here. Like I've really done the research I need to. I've educated myself on different resources. I'm going in offering these resources. That conversation comes first before any sort of punitive, I'm kicking you out thing. And the thing is it usually immediately arrives at the, like, there's a lot of frustration. It's not articulated. And then now all of a sudden it's coming to a head and we're going to kick you out. That's very common.
This is fantastic. And I actually, this is perfect because I think this segues perfectly into what you said in the beginning of this conversation as far as enabling. And you're saying what we should be enabling is access to resources and options. That's the proper way to enable someone to succeed. We're not enabling drug use, we're enabling their success. And I think that goes along the lines of trying to build the person up versus trying to tear them down to rock bottom. Because I can agree more with you. When you have nothing to lose, you have nothing to lose. So people die at rock bottom. That's what happens. But if you're able to build a person up somehow, well, now if they so choose to stop substance use, I think they're in a much better position to stop once they've been built up versus being completely torn down. And now this brings, so I couldn't agree more with that. And now this brings right into this. So when you say like resources and conversations and things like that, what specifically are you referencing? Like, are you saying like, hey, this is where the parents sit down and say, hey, you could go to a treatment center, you could work with this counselor, this coach, or you could like, what are the what are some generalized resources? I know different cases, different drugs, different resources maybe, but what do you mean by that? Resources? Like, what are some things?
So there's like clinical resources, there's treatment resources that's a little bit more like refined. So like under that umbrella of clinical, there's going to be other things that include clinical services and that also have like peer support services and stuff like that. But when I say resources, I'm not going, oh, they go to treatment immediately. That's not what I'm saying at all. If someone wants to do that, that's great. And if they want to do that, then there's a whole other level of research that needs to be had. So when I say resources, it means you educate yourself on literally all of the different types of resources and
Everything out there.
everything out there. Like
And
that's everything. And that's a lot. But again, you have to understand, okay, according to the logic that we have kind of laid out culturally, this is someone, and I don't subscribe to this really, but let's just use this logic. Someone is in a position to where they have a substance use disorder, a cannabis use disorder, alcohol use disorder, whatever, and that person is seen as incapable of making sound decisions usually.
Mhm.
Why are the parents then not going, this person seems to be capable of making sound decisions, that means I need to put myself in a position where I'm extremely informed when it comes to the options they have. That's what I see it as, is like, if we're going to see people as incapable, and maybe they are, not fully capable in certain areas, and that's fine. I just don't like to do the whole blanket, like just incapable completely. But if someone is in that space to where, they can't like competently take care of themselves and stuff, then it does put someone in a position, like parents or, authority figures, guardians, to where like it actually, I do believe that those individuals actually have a responsibility to then do very, very deep research. And what that means is things that are more accepted and things that are more alternative. So it doesn't just end at treatment, someone going to therapy, someone having counseling, someone having a consultant or a coach or someone. It doesn't end there. It ends at, can we make a compromise? Can we establish? And again, these things may be like totally not effective. That's the thing. Like when we're talking about the alternatives, and when we're talking about the things that are more or established. But for instance, like a more alternative thing would be like, okay, well, we will support you utilizing minor cannabinoids, so you
Yep.
can still
I
have
was going to say
you can
that.
still have the benefit of cannabis. Again, that's still being punitive towards one ingredient, one of the main cannabinoids. But again, that can sometimes be a compromise to where it's like, okay, we will accept that you use cannabis medically, even if it's not then transitioning to like non-psychoactive minor cannabinoids. That can also be a different thing, to where it's like, okay, if you're going to do this, then we can kind of solidify this and validate this with some sort of doctor's recommendation paired with some sort of mindfulness about what you're consuming. There's talks to be had about, is the issue that someone is not attempting to moderate at all, or there's all these different things that come into play. And so it's overwhelming, because it's like, okay, why are you not just giving me one answer? Because anyone who does that, they are out for themselves. They are trying to funnel you into whatever treatment center they are associated with. They are trying to push their own experience onto you and onto your loved one. And that's just, again, it can just be dangerous at best. So just again, to be more clear, we have inpatient treatment, which is primarily 12-step based, which I would encourage people to not send their loved ones to a 12-step based treatment center, because they lean heavily on 12-step, which should not be in the treatment industry according to their own traditions. It goes against the traditions of 12-step to use 12-step in a treatment setting. And there's a bunch of issues with that. Basically, people gain access to less clinical support when they're in 12-step treatment centers, because it's all leaning on 12-step. But again, you have inpatient treatment, you have kind of what goes into the aftercare continuum of care, which would be PHP, IOP, and often they call it sober living. So those are the more structured treatment things. And again, you want to ask these questions. Is this a 12-step treatment center? Okay, is this actually trauma informed? Is this a trauma informed treatment center? Okay, how is it trauma informed? What resources do what clinical resources do you have? Um, do you have how regularly does someone meet with their clinician? What kind of groups are facilitated? Again, there's a lot of questions that people don't know to ask, and you go in there. And that's what I do with a lot of my consulting of families. Is it's like, here's all the
Here's
questions,
everything.
here's all the answers, here's all of these different things. There's never a one size fits all approach for this ever. And that's the thing, is that you will find a one size fits all approach if you just go on the internet and start searching.
I think what you're saying is so important too. You know, my doctorate is in chiropractic, right? But when I see someone for back pain, I don't actually say, and I guess a lot of people might, but I don't say, okay, you have back pain, so your only option is for me to crack your back, and that's it. And there's nothing else. I actually, when I meet with patients, I say, look, these are different ways that this could play out. We could do adjustments. We could do spinal decompression. There's cold laser therapy. If that doesn't work, we're going to set you up with pain management, and they might do injections. If that fails, based on your imaging, you might be a candidate for this outpatient surgery. There's stem cell therapy. There's platelet therapy. So when they come in and they're talking to me about back pain, I'm saying, look, here's a bunch of different ways that you can do this. Here's some of the generalized costs behind each of them and some of the generalized outcomes. If you're comfortable with what I'm going to do with you today, let's go through with treatment. If not, let's get you set up with one of these other people that might sound more appealing. That's how I've approached my practice for 10 years, and it's gone really well. And that is actually the ethical thing. Technically, in medicine, by law, you are supposed to offer people multiple options. You are not supposed to be biased by your own treatment. That's actually so lost in medicine in general. People don't know that. And you're just making a light go off in my head when it comes to addiction, how that's not even in the ballpark anymore. That's not even a thing. And I think what you're saying in this scenario is, and you bring me to another thought. I think we go into it with the parents, or whomever's in the situation goes into it thinking, in our case, we're talking about this parent example. So I'm going to say the parents thinking that they want to help the person, right? And what they're doing by giving an ultimatum ultimately is probably not going to be very helpful. And how can you actually help someone without knowing all of the various different options? And like you said, deeply exploring each of those options and then discussing them with, i.e., the patient or the loved one in this case. How can you help someone if you're not doing that? You're actually not helping them. You might be doing them more of a disservice. And that's what I'm kind of gathering from what I'm hearing you say, a disservice that probably is not going to line up with an outcome that the parent expected was going to be the ultimate outcome. And I just want to recap this because I think what you said is so important. When I talk to families and they say, well, it's no cannabis use in my house or no alcohol use in my house, I'm like, you said something very important. I'm like, so is it they can't drink at all? Or you don't want them getting plastered or belligerent in the house? Because there's a difference between like moderate alcohol consumption and getting violently drunk. There's a very stark difference in the home that occurs. There's a difference between maybe consuming really high concentration THC on someone who might be struggling with psychosis, maybe, or some other symptoms that are induced from God knows what scenarios in life. There's a difference between that and a high quality CBD, CBN, CBG. Because if the person is saying, well, this really helps me sleep, and what we're hearing them say is, well, my main concern isn't necessarily I'm smoking weed, but I feel that cannabis really helps me with sleep. Well, maybe there's some alternatives out there. If that's what you're concerned with as a parent, then I'm going to try and help you sleep better. Maybe that's medication. Maybe that's other cannabinoids. Maybe it's, God knows, some other type of therapy involving sleep. Maybe it's lifestyle changes and the person is working with, maybe they have an unhealthy lifestyle and they're working with a lifestyle coach that's going to help them with fitness and nutrition. And maybe it's that. I, I, I think listening is so important too. And when you give someone an ultimatum, I don't think there's any communication anymore because it's here's your decision. I don't care what you, as the person that I'm trying to help has to say. I'm telling you what I want to do and how we're going to do this. And ultimately there's no listening there. I just wanted to recap some of that because you made some great thoughts pop into my head there.
No, I love it. Yeah, really, just it's really valuable to go back and to add that kind of context as well, I think. And the thing here to really understand is, like, as I kind of mentioned, a lot of times there's a lot of conversations that are not had. Sometimes those conversations are had, and the scenarios that they are had, usually not the best communication tactics are employed. And it's again, it's coming from this, like, I'm the parent, I'm the authority in this scenario, and I'm telling you what's going to happen. And it's okay to be a little bit flexible and to ask questions and to go, hey, like, what's what do you feel is going on? What are you trying to help or treat with this? Is there something that is going on with that? Is there? And then there's often, like, really really important conversations that can be had, and then that can act as kind of like a roadmap when it comes to different resources. So if someone's like, I have this event of trauma that I'm dealing with, then it's like, okay, well, then obviously having some sort of trauma informed support is like a very very clear answer. So it needs to be a collaborative process. And so there is kind of a little bit of, like, having to be very careful with, kind of, unfortunately, almost like tone policing yourself, which sucks. And I wish people didn't have to do that. But um, again, a lot of times the first conversation is had with a very, very intense tone and an energy of anger that is often masked fear. A lot of times it's like, I'm scared for my loved one and I want the best for them. And so when you share and you actually don't cover up the emotion, usually it's received. It's a lot more
It's
likely to be received if you're like, I love you, I'm worried, I'm scared. Now there are going to be some people who don't like that either, of course, but it's kind of the most palatable or realistic way to go about this. So there's a whole other aspect, and it's, again, mindful communication. So you can come into this and be like, have all the resources and do all the research, but then have, like, a tone that is seen as unacceptable, and then none of that will be heard or seen. And so that's why I also brought up the fact that sometimes you need a actual, like, clinical moderator to
not
sit there and
necessarily an
moderate.
interventionist, a moderator. I
Yeah, no,
completely agree. You bring me to something. Me and my wife, we've had one or two therapy sessions since our marriage, not necessarily anything pertaining to us, but pertaining to family events and family dynamics and very sensitive topics. Okay. And going into marriage, we understood this about our different family dynamics. Mine is kind of crazy. She has her own family dynamics. And we made an agreement and we said, instead of having these conversations on our own, where we might wind up slinging insults about one another's families or just saying things that don't really need to be said, why not just have a third person just interpret and moderate the whole conversation? Someone who's experienced in this stuff,
yeah,
have someone just interpret. And I'll tell you, Macaulay, that has worked like a charm. I mean, I've been married for a few years now, and it's been a wonderful thing. And we've had maybe what I would call two crisis type moments when it comes to family dynamics. And instead of us trying to hash that out of our own emotions and our own stuff, we say, let's just hit the brakes. We got this clinician actually that we really like. Let's just go sit down with them. And the clinician, I'll tell you, they're not even really giving us solutions or outcomes or advice on what to do. They're literally just saying, like, this is kind of where Frank's coming from. This is where you're coming from, Taylor. And is there like a middle ground here? And it keeps us from going at each other or going at each other's families in a really nice way. So I think that, but again, I don't have someone intervening saying, Frank, this is how you're going to handle this. And Taylor,
yes,
this is what you're going to do. And you're going to tell his family off and he's going to tell your, no. They're like, this is what I'm hearing. Do you guys agree? Yeah, we do agree that is what we're hearing. Okay. Where are we going to take this next? What do you guys think we should do to handle this? Macaulay, I want to bring this up so I don't sidetrack. A lot of, because this is right in line with how I feel about this topic, a lot of what we're actually discussing has very little to do with the person using substances, and it has to do with the family members themselves. And I often find this to be the case in these situations, as in you're saying, hey, check your own tone. Check your own communication skills. Just because you're a parent doesn't mean you know how to properly communicate, especially properly communicate with someone who is going through a mental health crisis, who may or may not be suffering from a substance use disorder. And guess what? I wouldn't expect most parents to know how to do that. I wouldn't expect that. They're not trained it. You're not given a handbook on that when it comes to parenting, or when it comes to your spouse or your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your significant other, right? People go through years of education and research to figure out how to do that. So I think that that's really important. Now, this is what I'm trying to say about families, though, because I think this is just, oh my gosh, this is where I start with families. I know for me, I was very fortunate. I had a nice family upbringing, but there was divorce, there was lots of turmoil, and it could definitely be described as traumatic. My parents did not speak to each other and lived in the same house with one another for over 15 years. And in 15 years, maybe they said 30 words to each other. That's traumatic to see growing up. Now, this is where I'm going with this, though. I often say to family members, a lot of younger people, your significant other, whatever, they want security, they want predictability, they want to feel comfortable. And I find it very, very hard when I have a family that's in chaos, who's trying to speak to their younger child or their adult child, quote unquote. Okay, not a child, but their adult son or daughter.
Yeah.
And they're saying, listen, we need stability from you. We need predictability from you. We need you to end the substance use. I know for me in that scenario, I looked at my parents. I was like, listen, this is the most stable thing in my life right now, is the fact that I can come home, get high, and not have to deal with your guys's bullshit. Okay. And I think a lot of families don't check themselves and check their own tone and their own stability. Would you agree with that? Or do you think and so go ahead, take that.
Yeah. So yeah, there's so much here. Wow. So within traditional spaces, they'll say it's a family disease. I don't agree that it's a disease on a family level. I think it's a generational thing that, and it doesn't mean that anyone else in your family has a substance use disorder necessarily. So trauma, I adhere more to like Dr. Gabor Mate's theories around
Yep.
trauma and substance use disorders. And so you can actually have a very presentable family and no adverse childhood events and still have a lot of trauma. So I often, the missing part in communicating that I didn't really even address before, and this is usually, I usually talk about this in the context of intervention, is when you're going to someone and you're like, hey, you need to stop doing this thing, you have to also acknowledge what you have done to that person.
You
And
have to.
if you have harmed them or traumatized your child, and you are not, and that is not part of the conversation when you are trying to offer resources, then that can prevent them from even wanting to utilize them. So again, that's a whole other part of the conversation, not just in the conversation of, hey, you're going to treatment, like, also in the conversation that's more educated. So there's the like less educated, fear-based, I've reached out to some random interventionist or random treatment center, and now we're facilitating an intervention and we're going into it. Then yeah, like the person who is presented as an expert is generally not going to have you really do any of that. There's not going to be any emphasis on like your own behavior when it comes to how you may have affected your child, your child's unique traumas, all that stuff. So that is a whole other story. Now imagine, just put yourself in someone's shoes that let's say they feel traumatized by people in their family, and then now those very same people are ganging up on them and going, hey, you need to stop doing this. It's a very interesting thing that plays out in that moment, because then it's like you are being betrayed and you are now being told and coerced into this sentence of not being able to do the one thing that you feel helps you. And so it's it's really tricky. There's often people who have traumatized someone sitting there and centering themselves and sharing about how they are traumatized by the individual, basically. So then it ends up being this like this uneven dynamic of like, you've traumatized me, I'm scared for your life, I don't want you to die. And then it's like that person may want to die. So that's the big thing to look at here, is like that person may actually legitimately want to die, and they may be traumatized by things that you may see as insignificant. That's the other thing, is when we talk about trauma on like a cultural level, it's all like adverse childhood events. That's usually what people think of. Sexual abuse, physical abuse, or just emotional abuse. Now, there are things that people are not aware of that are experienced as an event of trauma. So the person who did something is not aware at all, because it wasn't a really adverse event. It wasn't a catastrophic event. And so that's something to be that needs to be considered. And that's where, instead of using that as an opportunity, using like the confrontation as an opportunity to air out your grievances, those grievances should be aired out with a clinician. Without that individual, it should not be the person. The person should not be present at all until you've worked through it. Then you can have those conversations. Say, hey, like, this is how I felt about this, after like unpacking it and working on it. And then you can, in a constructive way, say what you need to say. I'm not trying to police what people say to other people, but it's like, it just doesn't logically make any sense when that individual needs support, and they want other people to show up for them usually. And instead of that, it's like, this is what you've done. This is how you've made me feel. This is how you've scared me. You also can't do the one thing that you feel is helping you. And also, we're going to isolate you. So what does that do? It leads to a decline in mental health and decline in resources if someone doesn't adhere to the boundary, which again is being implemented in a way that's not an acknowledgement of how boundaries can effectively work. And it's unfortunate, because it perpetuates this family dynamic, because if the individual leaves and then now is unhoused and then passes away, or just continues in that for however long, and things get worse for them and all that, those dynamics are still going on within the family. So the individual, my friend Christina Dennis, who's a professional interventionist, and one I agree with, actually, which I don't agree with almost any of them, is like, this person is actually the brave individual who is like bringing these things to the surface, even if it's not intentional, or even if they're not directly saying anything. Their behavior is bringing awareness to a family dynamic that is probably present if you have a child with a substance use disorder. It does not, again, throw away the idea that it needs to be this idea that you had to have physically abused them or something. No, it's that doesn't even need to be part of it. It can be things that, again, if you're, and then here's the other thing, if you're a parent who's had childhood events that were adverse, you're going to look at whatever your kid's saying, if it's not that, as insignificant. Like, what are you talking about? I was physically abused as a kid, and now you're telling me that because I made you go to summer camp, you're traumatized. So then it ends up being this trauma Olympics that's going on between parent and child. And it's like, no, we can validate people's traumas, and then again use that as a roadmap. So it all comes down to, like, everyone needs to have, like, engage in their own autonomy, and has a responsibility to make sure that their stuff is in check to a certain degree, and that they're educated and informed. And then the people who are at a disadvantage, there needs to be really a lot of consideration and tactfulness, because, again, according to the logic that most people subscribe to, is that we're dealing with someone who's maybe not fully capable or competent. I combined capable and competent. Capable or competent in moving forward in some sort of solution. So yeah, I mean, that was a lot.
That was awesome.
Yeah.
Very, very, very informative. Now, I want to say one other thing too that I find fascinating. I think a lot of people overlook about substance use. And then I want to talk about a more extreme case where maybe the person does have psychosis. Maybe the individual is violent and they're in their house. I want to jump into that next. But I think this case we talked about covers a lot of scenarios for a majority of people, okay? Or maybe where the person's life is at immediate threat of overdose or something like that. I want to talk about more extremes. But before I want to say one thing to parents listening. Something that's very overlooked in addiction is in someone who actually has an addiction. Let's start there, who has a clinical substance use disorder. the chances of self-recovery, i.e., they just wake up one day and stop, are extremely high. When you look into the research on this, and I would encourage anyone to read the book called The Freedom Model. And actually, if you have a loved one who may be struggling, and this is not a paid post, I like the people who wrote this book. I like the people who did it. They just point out statistics and data about substance use. And with treatment, without treatment, the chances of being recovered and someone just saying, you know what, I'm sick of drinking, I'm tired of being hungover, I'm done. I'm sick of smoking cigarettes, I'm tired of the way it's impacted my breathing, I'm done, is very, very, very high, even for more severe substance, quote unquote, severe substances, cocaine, opioids, this, that. Okay. Now, so I like to tell families that, because sometimes they'll hammer away at me when I work with them. Like, we got to get Timmy to stop, which I don't do. I talk to Timmy like we talk about, but I like to tell families, like, hey, just so you know, irrelevant of contacting me and irrelevant of shipping him off to a treatment center, actually, statistically, in some cases, it's worse with treatment, which I know you're aware of, the long-term outcomes, than the person just eventually stopping on their own. So I like to tell families that, who might be in a really bad situation right now, but there's not psychosis, immediate violence, immediate death present. Okay. I'm throwing that disclaimer in. There's a very high chance, higher than not, that that individual is going to, quote unquote, grow out of it, or continue at an use eventually that's moderate and no longer harming them in reality. So, anyways, I want to say that. Now, can we move on to something more serious? So let's take a different scenario. We got mom and dad, there's other siblings in the house, and the person is using substances. And let's go in the case of, let's not talk about death, but let's talk about violence. They are truly psychotic. And unfortunately, I have dealt with this, where I actually had a young girl once out of Ontario contact me and tell me her entire plan on how she was going to kill her family. And she was she was psychotic. And this had been kind of ongoing. This wasn't the first instance of this. And what do you do in those scenarios? What do you say when you got someone who's drunk and violent, who's in a state of psychosis and harmful to surrounding family? What do you do then?
Yeah, well, really quickly, I want to say, yeah, you mentioned spontaneous
Oh,
remission, which is what people can look up if they want more information on spontaneous remission, because it's a real thing that does exist, and it actually, again, is, you can find solid information on that. And I mean, on the topic of like psychosis, there's just a protocol that I kind of subscribe to the same thing that like clinicians would, you know, and it's this idea that if someone is in that state, then they need like a higher level of care for their own safety and for others' safety, which is hard for me to say because I understand the quality or lack thereof within psychiatric
yes.
facilities. But look, there are certain scenarios to where I've just from like the sidelines, I've witnessed professionals managing these things many different ways. There are certain scenarios to where it is not 100% required to 5150 someone, is what we're talking about, which you can look up what that is, like a code 5150, and then there's 5250, I believe, which is like a little bit longer. So yeah, I mean, the answer is to stick to that kind of protocol. Even if you're not a clinical person, I do believe that everyone who's aware of this kind of has a responsibility to enact that, which is, again, very conflicting. But the way that I often explain it to people is like, yeah, your loved one might be traumatized by their stay at this facility, but they'll be alive though. So then you just have someone with another experience of trauma, which is not desirable,
Yeah.
but that's
They're
that's it.
alive.
I mean, sorry, like I can't really say anything else other than, yeah, if they're like clearly in that state, then it's something that a lot of families will try to manage on their own, and then stuff
Y-
can go
y-
real sideways real
I think
fast.
in that case, what I hear you saying is you definitely need to get outside help sooner than later. ideally you find someone who knows what they're doing, and they're gonna kind of guide you on what to do with that person, hopefully.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, it's also tricky because you have to understand that it's very dependent on how you get someone into that space. For instance, if you call the cops and that person is erratic, your loved one could literally be killed. So,
mhm,
people need to understand that. Um,
mhm.
yeah, it has a lot to do with how you facilitate getting them into that supervised psychiatric setting or facility, and so it should not be taken lightly of like, oh, I'm gonna call the cops right now. Now, like, again, if that person is, and this is not medical advice or clinical
Of
advice at all,
course.
but if that person, let's say, it has not been taking their antipsychotics, then I'm not telling one to do this, but it would be compassionate in the spirit of like crisis management to get that medication into their system.
Yep,
Um, However you can. And then again,
yep.
that's not conventional. I'm not telling anyone to do that. Sometimes these things have to be kind of based like case to case. And again,
I
if
understand.
someone's in a psychosis and they have Seroquel prescribed to them and they've not been taking it, that medication could very likely bring them out of that. And then you may have an easier time getting them into some sort of like continuum of care for mental health. So it needs to be seen as just a complete mental health crisis. That's it. And then you follow the protocol. Is if someone expresses that they're going to hurt themselves or others, then they unfortunately pretty much have to be 5150. And I hate to say it,
Yeah,
honestly, because
I
it just
understand.
sucks.
I understand. I think that comes to a bigger issue of we don't have great management of these things. That's just it. Mental health is poorly
Yeah.
managed, and we don't have great options. And that we just don't have good options. I think that's what that is, and that's a bigger issue that um, I'm not going to tackle, but hopefully someone does one day. Now, with that being said, maybe my voice will be a part of it. But now, with that being said, I have one last scenario on an equally morbid note. Is the individual who is they are at risk of dying. They continue to use this substance in the home, and there is a good chance that they are going to die. And the family says, we don't want that to happen here. Like we understand if you use the gun, you're at immediate risk of overdose. You overdosed a bunch of times. And now obviously we're getting away from cannabis at this point. Okay. Like we're talking about all other substances now. What do you think in those scenarios where they're saying, look, you're about to die. If you do this again, we don't want you doing that in our home. So you're out. Is it kind of the same thing? The family needs to be informed on what the options are and moving forward and still try and have a very reasonable conversation, or is it maybe something more extreme?
So it's definitely something that is more intense because we're talking about someone who's in need of harm reduction protocols, risk reduction tools, and you need to be aware of harm reduction philosophy. So there's the practice of harm reduction,
Great
there's
answer.
philosophy of harm reduction, and there's risk reduction tools. So immediately, I mean, look, if you get to the place to where your loved one has overdosed repeatedly and you're like, I just don't want you to die in my house, they're going to probably die by themselves isolated. So that's something that some people are actually um, that's where they arrive. That's where
Yep.
they arrive. They've had it. That's where they're at, and that's okay for them. Um, Hindsight is always 2020. So I've never heard of anyone who does that and then afterwards feels good about it.
Yep.
Because if you think about your loved one dying, it'd probably be better if they were in a home near loved ones than like literally out on the streets or in like a, you know, in like a bando and like an abandoned building or, the
Hmm.
stereotypical stuff. So you have to basically make a decision. Like if that's where you're at, then you are very likely not going to see your loved one again and that they will die in isolation. Um, Now, if you have willingness to employ some evidence-based approaches, the first thing is like we're going to be talking about people with opioid use disorder when we're
Hmm.
speaking on this. So there are evidence-based medications like Suboxone, Methadone, Sublocade. These medications can be implemented and can effectively, you know, put someone in a position of actual recovery. Like it can immediately put them in a state of recovery based on the fact that they have a consistent source for a regulated medication. So there's that conversation should be had way before there's any conversation of kicking someone out. And like that is should be the first line of defense, is evidence-based medications that are proven to have high efficacy. On the other side, again, Google harm reduction and don't just look at the first definition. Go and look in detail of like
deep dive.
The 8 principles of harm reduction, and you're going to probably agree with them. When you probably, if you're a parent, you've heard harm reduction, you associate it with like continued drug use, basically.
Oh, you're just gonna give my son the needles now? No,
Yeah,
that's
like,
not what I said. No, I didn't say that.
Yeah, people need to research harm reduction, look at the 8 principles of harm reduction, look at risk reduction, which is a part of it, and educate yourself on that. So if your loved one is in your house and they use opioids at all, even if they don't have an opioid use disorder, you need to be trained on how to administer naloxone, aka Narcan. You need to be trained on how to give rescue breaths. You can sustain someone and without naloxone too. You should get naloxone, but you can sustain someone with rescue breaths. If they still have even like a weak heartbeat, you can still sustain like them long enough for EMS to get there. So that's right out of the gate. Like if you have a loved one that's using any sort of powders or pills, even if they are not primarily seeking opioids, you should have naloxone in your house and be educated on how to administer it, and again, how to do rescue breaths. And you go a little bit deeper and you can look at, other tools. Trying to change the mode of administration can create a huge reduction in risk, which is a conversation people don't want to have. If someone is using intravenously and they go to smoking, that can have a direct reduction in risk. That's a conversation is so stigmatized and just sounds ridiculous to people. It's like, what are you talking about? So it just depends on what you're willing to do, and if you are willing to implement things that are stigmatized, but that can save your loved one's life. That's it. How willing are you to do something that's stigmatized? That's the question you need to ask yourself. But even the medications are stigmatized. Suboxone, methadone, stigmatized. For those that are worried about like how if they get on Suboxone, they can never get off, because you've heard some information about that. Sublocade makes it very easy to get off Suboxone. You get a Sublocade shot once a month. Whenever you want to get off, you don't get the shot again. The buprenorphine that is injected into you in a reserve, it slowly dissipates, and that person does not experience any sort of wild catastrophic withdrawal syndrome. So medications for recovery, risk reduction protocols. And if you get to the point, I've had it with parents that I'm consulting where they're like, this is where I'm at. I'm done with this. And if they pass away on their own, they accept that. So I disagree with that.
But you're not them.
Yeah. And I'm not them. I don't know their complex traumas. And, that's just the reality of the situation, but usually those people have tried everything. Everything.
Of course. They actually did do everything. Yes. I understand.
Some people will use drugs until they die. Yeah, that's something that people need to understand. And what I think is we should make their life as easy as possible for the time that they're on Earth. That's just me. I'm just like, if you're not going to survive, and it seems almost inevitable because this person will not even utilize alternative resources, then that's where it goes into, let's see if we can kind of like make their life a little bit better while they're still around. And it sucks, but that's just the reality of it.
That's a very real answer. I think that's probably the realest answer a person's going to get. It's really on point. That's not sugar coated.
No, but just understand that if you send your loved one to treatment over and over again, that doesn't mean you've tried everything. So that's what ends up being we've tried everything. You've gone to the same type of 12-step treatment center like 20 times. That's not trying everything. You need to get more radical and more alternative. So that means maybe ayahuasca ceremony. Ketamine infusion, ibogaine in Mexico. I didn't mention all. That's the whole other thing. When I say researching everything, I mean everything. Psychedelic protocols, all of that. Until you've entertained all of that, you haven't tried everything. On
a lighter note, when I have people who are maybe quitting smoking cigarettes, which again, most people will stop when we talk about nicotine replacement therapy. So I'm like, I tried the gum, it failed. I'm like, okay. One, you tried one form of nicotine replacement therapy, and there's about 10 different forms out there now. Okay. And I'm like, so that's the first thing. And then I go and tell other stuff. I'm like, if you really want to stop, have you tried cold turkey? Have you tried moderation? Maybe you don't even want to stop. Maybe you just want to moderate. Maybe you just want to moderate your tobacco consumption. Have you tried, if you really want to stop, have you tried medication? Have you tried coaching, therapy, this, that? Have you tried reading a few books on it? There's some really good books out there on quitting smoking. Have you tried those? The person's like, no, I tried Nicorette and it failed. And I'm like, okay, so you tried one of maybe 20 different things that we could try. And I'm not saying that in a mean way, like, you dumbass, you tried one thing. No. I'm just saying, like, you're saying you tried, but I get it. You were told to do this. That was the only option you were presented with, and it failed you. Fine. There's a ton more options, though. I'm actually way more empathetic than I'm saying in this conversation. Maybe, but
I am too. So just to mention that.
Yeah. I think we're both way more empathetic, but yeah. But yeah, anyways, so and then this is just now, and we'll wrap it up with this, but you just made me think of harm reduction too. It's funny because in so many areas of life, harm reduction is celebrated. Someone quits smoking cigarettes, they use a nicotine patch or a gum, and people are like, good for you. And then, you come to like opioids, which I don't go into, and someone's on Suboxone, and people are like, oh, that's terrible. And it's like, wait a minute, how did we get that point of view? How did we take such a drastic jump? You don't judge the person for chewing Nicorette gum to quit smoking cigarettes, but now you're going to judge the person who's on Suboxone to get off meth. It doesn't make sense to me. You talk about this a lot. It has a lot to do with stigma, has a lot to do with lack of proper education on things. It has a lot to do with the fact that what we talk about in quote unquote treatment is not actually evidence-based. You talk about a lot of this stuff, and I would encourage anyone who wants to learn more about it to check out your socials, Sexton Space, across all platforms. Anyways, final thoughts that you have. That's my final thoughts. This was really good.
I really enjoyed this. So yeah, I'm coming from like a very direct perspective right now, and so anyone who's watching this that feels like I'm like pointing blame at parents, I just want to be clear that that's not my intention. I consult with parents sometimes exclusively, where I'm not even talking to like the person in question. And everyone who's in this position, if you're like worried for your loved one, or your loved one is experiencing any of the things that we discussed, you deserve your own healing, and you deserve your own recovery process. And if you educate yourself on the things that we talked about, that can also aid in that process of your own healing, your own process of moving forward or moving on or whatever. And that it's all about a personal autonomy. Like, I'm going to let people, or just like be there with people while they engage in their autonomy, even if I disagree with what they're doing. I just will only caution people when they're going against like evidence and things that are solidified. Anything that's more subjective, like I get it, I understand it, but we actually have a lot of resources now, and it's a beautiful thing. So that's a good thing. It's just the access to education on those resources, it gets kind of shut down because of where people go to try to get the information. So anything if you're Googling stuff and finding like articles that are produced by treatment centers, probably not a valid source. Anything that's within that realm, if you're just calling a random place and asking them, what do I do? They're going to want you to funnel your child into whatever treatment center they're working for. That's just what's going to happen. And that's a whole other story when it comes to patient brokering and insurance scams and all these other things. So you just need to be very aware that your vulnerability is not always met with like a tactful, compassionate approach. It's seen like blood in the water in a tank of sharks. Like, that's what often happens. So you got to advocate for yourself, focus on your self-care, focus on loving yourself, and you can show up better for your loved ones,
Macaulay, I really enjoyed this conversation. Who knows, maybe me and you will have another follow-up to this in the future. For those watching, I'm going to be interviewing all different types of people from treatment centers, people from 12-step, people from clinicians. Who knows, maybe we can get your interventionist friend on here. Whether or not I agree or disagree with these individuals, guys, I want you to hear all different types of perspectives on this, and you can draw your own conclusions from it. But I love this conversation. I can tell you I'm in alignment with a lot of what you say, if not everything. All right. I'm going to end this recording, folks. Thanks for being here. Macaulay, hang around for 1 second, and then we'll go from there. All right.